Chapter 70 Mantis, 3rd Update. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Riding a tall white horse, Lupo felt completely at ease, leading the army like a real general, commanding a large number of troops on foreign soil, directing a well-ordered fighting force. He felt a surge of confidence. Back before he crossed over, he'd had a small family and practiced riding. The army formed up, ready for battle. When both sides were set, they launched a full-on charge, continuing until one side couldn't hold any longer. This was the kind of war he'd been waiting for, armies lining up and then charging head-on. He loved the feeling. It was like something out of a medieval romance. His mixed infantry regiment consisted of 100 shield-bearing spearmen, 400 crossbowmen, and 10 shock cavalry teams directly under his command, plus 10 medics. Of course, the Lord couldn't own that many troops outright. To build an army that size would bankrupt him. The cost would be unsustainable compared to the size of his population, and even now, the army had only recently been expanded to this size. Before, it was only about a fifth as strong, around 200 spearmen and 10 light cavalry. He put his silver tongue to work to borrow the extra soldiers from the city-state lord. It was a common approach among lords. Expanding your own army took time, resources, and a lot of effort, so why not focus on production, gather resources, build a trading post, and just rent troops from the local city-state. The system even recognized these mercenaries as part of the Lord's own army. There was even a little exploit you could use. If you only signed the mercenaries for a month with a 110 turnover rate, it would only take 12 days for the 120-day contract to transfer to the employer. If they died late, they might ask for wages according to their combat time. This was much cheaper than signing them up for 4 months outright. And if those mercenaries got killed early on the battlefield, well, then you wouldn't have to pay them. Since nobody actually died in the training exercises, the more mercenaries you could borrow, the better. Lupo wasn't just hiring mercenaries, though. He had his own plans. Providing weapons, equipment, food, and wages for all these troops was a huge drain. All that money would eventually end up in the greedy city lord's pockets. The city lord didn't have to pay anything except provide the men and the technology, but Lupo was using this arrangement to get the equipment blueprints and unit designs from the city lord for free. The system would then recognize the related industrial buildings. Even if he left the city lord later, he'd still be able to produce these troops. Besides the infantry, he'd also spent a good deal of money to buy 4 heavy crossbows. He hadn't forgotten that this was a world with magical monsters. Those fantasy creatures would show up on the battlefield. He knew it was unrealistic to rely solely on regular soldiers to fight them. He needed powerful weapons, like heavy artillery. He debated between catapults and crossbows for a while, ultimately choosing the crossbows. While crossbows weren't as devastating as catapults, their pinpoint accuracy was unmatched. These 4 horse-drawn heavy crossbows had a range of 400. Their long-range power was only 150. But they were incredibly accurate and had high armor penetration. Once fired, these heavy crossbows carried an enormous amount of kinetic energy. He even considered using them to hunt a dragon. Dragon hunting, it sounded like something straight out of a fantasy novel. He'd heard that one of the lords was a dragon, and he really wanted to hunt it down and put its head on a spike on his town's walls. When he saw the large number of monster infantry and behemoth units in the training battlefield briefing, he knew the crossbows were worth every penny. The city lord had insisted on selling him the blueprint and the crossbows together, and he'd felt like he was getting ripped off all over again. Whoa there! Pulling back on the reins, Lupo stopped his white horse well away from the mud. The stench made him wrinkle his nose in disgust. Even from a few kilometers away, the faint black mist hanging in the air was impossible to miss. Any lord who saw that black mist would be drawn to it. What if there was treasure? Something that peculiar had to have treasure. That's what Lupo's gaming experience told him. When he arrived, he found a putrid, muddy swamp about the size of 2 football fields, with nothing in it but a few small mounds. Wait a minute, he spotted several overturned carriages sunk in the mud. Even though the mud had seeped inside, the broken windows revealed what was inside: gold and jewelry. Bingo, treasure. Lupo grinned. That cartload of gold and jewels was enough to feed his army for half a year, but things never went that smoothly for him. He caught sight of movement on the horizon. A white line appeared on the edge of the distant mountains. It was another lord's army, also drawn to the black fog. This elf lord had moved a step faster than Lupo, swearing allegiance to the 4th-level elven city-state connected to the trading post. He'd used his status as a lord to be recognized as an elf. As long as you looked more like a half-elf, these high-level elves would not be able to accept me so smoothly. Of course, this acceptance wasn't unconditional. He had to be loyal and fulfill the elves' requests. They promised to provide military support to protect the new member, and they even gave him a low-level elven hero to lead this military support. Not much, 1 elven archer hero and 2 squads of elven guards, sea guards, with spears and shields, 180 people in total. They had spears and up to 40 points of armor, plus a thick shield that could withstand most small projectiles from that era. Besides their spears, the elven troops also carried longbows, which were effective in close combat and had a range of 165 with 20 points of long-range power. Good for both short and long range, but there were only about 700 elves in your territory, which is the result of absorbing some of the elves from other city-states. Otherwise, there are only a few hundred people. With such a strong army, the elf lord obviously felt like he could puff out his chest and walk around like he owned the place on the PvP battlefield. He couldn't wait to show off the new spells he'd learned. Shortly after landing, he encountered a unit of 100 nomadic cavalry. Seeing the power of the elven guard's longbow fire boosted his confidence, and he felt like he was on top of the world. He preferred crushing a player over fighting the native NPCs. Little did he know that this was actually a PvP battlefield, and the system's matchmaking was always based on your territory's hidden total score, ensuring sufficient income while balancing the gap. The new lords who just entered the exercise battlefield have not yet felt the deep malice of the system. It didn't even say all of this. Okay, I've finished what I owe. I'll resume the daily 2 updates later. Chapter 71 Yellow Bird. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The elven lord also rode a horse, but unlike Lupo, he had only 2 white horses, one for himself and one for the elven archer traveling with him. The elven lord rode slowly in front of Lupo, flirting with the female archer beside him as they went. The hero, meanwhile, was stuck walking on the ground, leading his territory's elven troops, a mix of 20 soldiers with swords and bows, and elven infantry. Get out of the way, or fight. Both sides seemed to have some sense of honor left. The elven lord didn't order his archers to snipe Lupo, and Lupo didn't load his crossbow to take a shot at the arrogant elf. Troops whose lord had fallen wouldn't just retreat, they'd continue fighting under the command of the highest-ranking officer on the field. The lord, after being killed, could only float in the sky and watch. Hey, hold your horses. I was here first. Finders keepers, remember, Lupo scoffed. What was so great about elves anyway? No one had any significant magic talent yet. It was still a straight-up brawl of flesh and blood. Sure, low-level fireballs were occasionally seen, taking out a soldier at a time, maybe less if it hit an armored soldier, so why the big shot act? With just some armor and a crossbow, even if you're a little stronger, you can't stand against a good gun line, and no matter how tough you are, you're not made of stone. A crossbow bolt to the flesh goes right through. They were all well-trained troops. If the elven lord had been less of a jerk, Lupo might have reluctantly agreed to split the treasure. He didn't want to lose everything on day one. Winning would mean heavy losses, and losing would mean a full retreat and even bigger losses. They'd been here a while and were almost at the swamp's edge. There hadn't been any weird activity in the swamp. Maybe it was just a normal swamp. Take out the other side, and whatever monsters are in the swamp would be easy to deal with. At least, that's what they thought. The elven lord's half-elven blood gave him enhanced vision, and he spotted a glint of greed in the sunken carriage. He saw the treasures inside, and the female archer beside him seemed to take his greed for granted. On one side was a mixed force of human infantry, and on the other, for mixed regiments of elven infantry, it was a classic standoff. With valuable resources at stake, neither side was going to back down easily. Ji Lin, hiding in the bushes and observing, was thrilled. His original plan was to observe the combat effectiveness of the human infantry and let them deal with the corrupted magic crabs. In the swamp first. If they couldn't beat the crabs, he'd harvest them both. He also felt like something was off about the swamp. The magic crab seemed to be kept apart by something. Looking at the size of both sides, he knew they had hired mercenaries. A lord developing normally wouldn't have that many troops unless they went for a military-civilian hybrid structure. These mercenaries would see the permanence of this battlefield as a miracle, thinking they were fighting like warriors in Valhalla. It was a two-way adjustment. The locals knew a little about the system of eternal existence, but their world's mythology consisted of various gods that disappeared long ago, but their power system had somehow persisted. The lords were adapting to these city-states, and these city-states were testing the lords. Some forces had tested the limits of the system, eventually triggering their expulsion. Mercenaries, a mixed bag. The advantage was getting a lot of troops quickly at a low cost. Using what's available is always faster than building from scratch. The downside was that when you need the specific troops you want, you won't have a large number of trained soldiers from your own territory. Eventually, population won't be so scarce, and each lord can afford a standing army. Long-term mercenary contracts cost more than maintaining your own. And for permanent employment, it's better to just train your own. The highest level of city-state was level 5. When lords broke through the 5th era, they found there were no new high-level city-states to contact. They'd have to chart their own military paths. According to some lords' intel, there used to be super city-states of level 7 or even 8. But they were all gone. Even the lords' later expeditions were just grave robbing. Some especially powerful blueprints could only be found by looting graves. The conversation between the two lords only lasted a few minutes. Then they split up and returned to their lines. The two armies had deployed and were preparing to fight, forming square formations. The edges of the battlefield were already boggy. It would be a fair fight. Later in the training exercises, there wasn't so much communication. Only in this early phase did both sides still follow some rules. Lin felt he was a little too close. He patted the hunting spider's head and pointed toward the swamp, signaling it to charge in after his first whistle, jumping toward the small hills and jumping high. Then he pointed to the tense troops, indicating that it should charge them after jumping, and come back after the second whistle. He wasn't sure if the hunting spider understood, but it was the smartest one he had. If it wasn't smart, he wouldn't have brought it. Not all hunting spiders were intelligent. Some were just plain dumb and followed the others. He began to crawl back slowly, using his stealth skills. Spears and lances gleamed, sharp and cold in the sun. Crossbowmen began to draw. For heavy crossbows started to build power as the capstans turned. Light cavalry on white horses circled at the edge of the formation, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Once war is decided, words are useless. No matter who wins, they'll suffer heavy losses. The fisherman was ready to reel them in. As for being ambushed, that's what happens when you don't scout the area. He wasn't above teaching these young lords a lesson. Chapter 72 Crossbow and Bow. You are listening at novelfull.audio. If you ask Lin, he'd tell you that infantry charges back in the day were something to behold. Imagine soldiers lined up, shields raised, advancing as one. These dense ranks marched forward in lockstep. The sheer length of the infantry line meant Lupo's regiment could stretch out twice as far as the elves. This allowed more soldiers to attack simultaneously. The problem with stretching your line thin is that it loses its depth. If the soldiers in front fell, there weren't enough reserves to fill the gaps, and the enemy could punch right through. Once that happened, it was like a string of dominoes falling. The line would crumble, and the remaining soldiers would be flanked and overwhelmed. Lupo, despite having more men, didn't want to risk individual skirmishes. He knew that sending his infantry piecemeal against the elves, who were physically superior, would only result in them getting picked off. Maintaining that infantry formation took guts. Soldiers had to face death head-on, endure a barrage of arrows, crossbow bolts, and catapult stones, all while keeping their ranks tight. They had to follow orders and march in formation. It demanded either incredible bravery or strict military discipline to face that kind of onslaught. A soldier was only effective as part of the unit. No matter how strong he was, he had no room to maneuver in the dense enemy ranks and could only become another casualty in the brutal melee. After all, flesh and blood are no match for sharp steel. The two armies stretched out for half a mile, a glittering spectacle under the sun, slowly closing in on each other's long-range firing zone. Lupo chose to deploy his infantry with a wide front, simply because he had the numbers. This also allowed his crossbowmen to be more effective, since they could fire straight ahead. Unlike archers, they needed a clear line of sight. The frontline troops were there to create that space for them. A typical crossbowman could shoot about 160 yards, 20 yards further than G-Lin's light crossbows. Plus, their weapons packed 30% more punch, boasting 22 points of ranged power. They wouldn't be outranged by the elf guards. On one side stood a 400-man crossbow unit, and on the other, a mixed force of 400 elven archers. The horns signaling the advance slowly died down, and the troops raised their shields. In the gaps, the crossbowmen lifted their already loaded crossbows. The elf guards' heavy shields provided far better protection than the ironclad would of Lupo's troops. These elite soldiers from the elven city-state were superior in quality to Lupo's raw recruits and could withstand the crossbow bolts, and they did. The elf lord, watching from the rear, smiled with satisfaction. His elite infantry formed a solid shield wall, deflecting the worst of the crossbow fire. Only a few were grazed by bolts that slipped through the gaps. The situation on the flank wasn't as rosy. He had positioned most of his elite guards in the front. Under the same density of fire, they were taking casualties. This slow-burn battle was like a chess match, each side responding to the other's moves. The army marched on, resolute, while the crossbowmen reloaded. The infantry continued its advance. The elf lord felt a bead of sweat trickle down his temple, but he glanced at the proud female archer beside him, and his confidence returned. Under the hero's command, the elf guards and the bow-wielding militia halted and raised their bows. Arrows rained down. Their arrows flew farther and truer than those of human archers. Years of hunting experience made them deadly with a bow. Although they had to worry about crossbow fire from the infantry regiment, they couldn't unleash their full firepower in the short window. Lupo watched his troops scream in agony, his face darkening. His crossbowmen had no shields. Although the volley hadn't killed many, the morale of the soldiers in front of him was visibly collapsing. Facing a storm of arrows without any cover, their morale plummeted. He had been planning to use his heavy crossbows, the four-shot beasts, to break through the enemy line when they were ready for close combat. He knew those shield guards were tough, and their armor was hard to match in hand-to-hand combat. But he hoped that the heavy crossbows would blast a hole, and his infantry could exploit the weakness and crush the elves. These heavy crossbows were his trump card, but they took forever to reload. He nodded to his hero, who immediately understood and relayed the order. He had been holding back. The four slow-moving heavy crossbows, loaded with special armor-piercing bolts, were wheeled into position. The infantry line, enduring the arrow fire, advanced slowly, protecting the crossbowmen and giving them a clear field of fire. The elf lord, hiding behind his troops, kept glancing at the beautiful elf girl next to him. What a magnificent battle! The elf lord nodded, preening. Watching the enemy infantry being suppressed by the arrow fire filled him with pride, and he let his imagination run wild. He wasn't much of a commander himself, so how could he really understand the battlefield? He felt like he was wasting the hero he had borrowed from the elven city-state. He just needed to wait for his troops to win him a glorious victory and then take the credit. The battle was going exactly as planned. Victory was within his grasp. Lupo was waiting for his crossbowmen to reload a second time, and for his infantry to reach charging distance. He was also waiting for his cavalry to reach the flanks, ready to attack. Meanwhile, Ji-Lin, hidden on a distant hillside, watched the battle with interest. This lord's fighting style was unexpectedly methodical, if a bit rigid. The elven lord's tactics were too predictable. Didn't they see the four heavy crossbows? While a dense formation was good for defense and resisting ordinary crossbows, it was also a perfect target for siege weaponry. If Ji-Lin hadn't been lying in wait nearby, this battle would have ended in a bloody victory for the human lord. But then again, those hills weren't as stable as they seemed. Without his intervention, the corrupted crabs, drawn by the scent of blood, were starting to stir. The smell of war, death, and blood drifted into the swamp on the wind, awakening these sleeping monsters. Their hunger for corpses and blood was insatiable. Chapter 73 Steel Harvest. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Lupo's playing 4D chess, even if he doesn't realize it. If his opponent spreads their forces thin, he can concentrate his firepower and overwhelm them, but when they turtle up like this, all he can do is hope. Fire! Lupo roared, and his infantry regiment snapped their shields up, creating gaps for the crossbowmen. They peeled away from the main line, and the crossbows began spitting out death. heavy crossbow bolts, with blades widened specifically to tear through infantry, flew across the 200 yards. They sliced through the shield wall, the elven guards in front, and anyone unlucky enough to be standing nearby, like a hot knife through butter. The elves' shields and armor were worthless against these weapons of war. The sheer killing power of the crossbows against a tight formation was beyond anyone's wildest dreams. Each bolt took out at least 5 elves, sending 15 or more souls to the afterlife. It's all about mechanical energy, storing it up and then unleashing it in the most devastating way possible. Next came a storm of regular crossbow bolts. The crossbowmen, using the paths cleared by the heavy crossbows, peppered the gaps. The outer shield wall was gone. Now it was their time to shine. With the shields out of the way, flesh and blood were no match for the steel-tipped arrows. The elf guards, despite their training, could barely hold their ground. The militia behind them, armed with bows and swords, were getting shredded by the volleys. The elf lord's eyes bulged with rage. The female archer beside him gritted her teeth, raised her bow, and focused her magic, trying to take out a crossbow cart. But they were too far away, nearly 300 yards, so she settled for putting down 2 shield-bearing spearmen to vent her frustration. Infantry. Charge, thought Lupo wasn't about to give the elves a breather. He gave the order for a decisive charge, hoping to capitalize on their low morale. The ranged harassment was over. Now the real fight, of guts and skill, began. The crossbows were just softening them up for the main event. In a time before truly effective ranged weapons, close-quarters combat was still the way to win a battle. Spearmen found their spears bouncing off elven armor. The elves, in turn, shoved their spears into the spearmen, the sharp tips easily finding the weak points in their armor. But as one elf tried to pull his spear back, he found himself exposed. A dozen spears plunged into the gap, felling the elf. The cavalry charged, slamming into the panicked elven militia from the front and sides. Infantry heads were lopped off by longswords, bodies torn open by the crossbowmen's short spears and swords. The trained infantry and the skilled elven guards spilled their blood on the open plain. The earth drank it in. To them, it was just a game, like players fighting over resource points. The winner got the spoils. But they didn't realize the monsters themselves were reacting to the Lord's actions. He checked his pocket watch, using the glass to flash a signal to Chongheng. The reflected light was hard to spot at a distance. Chongheng noted the time. The 2 lords were locked in a bloody brawl, and the steel harvest was about to begin. Thank God for the tall grass. Without it, Ji Lin wouldn't be able to watch the battle so calmly. The musketeer team had already gotten within 500 yards of the elves, bringing 200 stealth scout hunting spiders with them. The light crossbowmen weren't experienced enough to handle an ambush like this. Ambush is all about surprise. These green troops were too slow and lacked the combat savvy of the veterans. The human lord near the swamp was left to the corrupted devil crab. Ji Lin would help the elf lord out, setting up a nice little ambush for him. Teamwork makes the dream work. They linked up with the musketeers, who were waiting for Ji Lin's signal, weapons loaded, hidden in the bushes, cold and quiet. Counting down, controlling their breathing, the steam spiders move at about 20 miles per hour, 10 yards a second. So it'll take 100 seconds to cross that distance and burst out from behind the hill. 1 minute, 10 seconds, that's when the steam spiders launched their attack. 500 yards, 100 yards, 300 yards, 250 yards. I don't like this, she said. A bad feeling washed over her. She glanced at the half-elf lord beside her, but he seemed oblivious. She regretted choosing such a useless partner. The carnage in front of her disturbed her intuition, and the heavy losses forced her to focus all her attention on the battle. Even though she knew her people wouldn't really die, seeing the destruction still twisted her gut. Even with the odds stacked against them, they still had a chance. The elven guards were well trained, far superior to these humans, but why? Her eyes darted back. The tall grass in the distance was swaying unnaturally. A whistle cut through the air. Countless figures in gray rose from the tall grass, steel guns in hand, eyes cold, aimed right at her and the fighting elves. The gunfire erupted like thunder, tearing through armor like paper. A wall of lead bullets ripped through the elven guards and militia, felling them like grass before a mower. The few infantry caught in the crossfire died alongside the elves. The elven guards raised their shields, but they only stopped a couple of bullets before shattering. Their armor was useless, they heard a high-pitched whine, a mechanical shriek, and then, monsters spewing white mist. It took 3 minutes, maybe 5, before their distraction ended. Everyone's attention was torn from the fight. It was over, the 6-legged steel monsters crashed into the enemy lines. Compared to a 60-man cavalry charge, the impact of 10 steam spiders was devastating. Facing the monstrous infantry, the remaining elven guards, somehow still standing, tried to fight back with their spears. They saw the glowing runes in the joints, and knew these were rune machines. If they just charge, it'll be scary, but we can do it. Then, superheated steam shot from the center of each spider, and smaller bursts erupted from the sides to block counterattacks. They died screaming, cooked alive. Chapter 74 Companion. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Superheated steam melts through those armors like butter. Before it even reaches their lungs, the pain alone kills them. It's a surprisingly gentle death. The system has a pain threshold built in to prevent unnecessary suffering. These soldiers sent to the battlefield aren't exactly themselves. They're more like snapshots of their souls, pulled from different points in their lives. They are them, but also not. When the exercise ends, these soul snapshots return to their bodies, bringing back new knowledge and skills, but they can't bring back the courage to face life or death situations, or the drive to push forward. It wipes out the bad stuff, but the good enhancements are minimal too. Emotions are a double-edged sword. When the stakes are even, you can choose to drop your weapon and walk away, or you can stand your ground and fight, embrace the possibility of death. Skills alone aren't enough, and neither is pure faith. As for the heroes and lords, they're thrown into the simulation themselves. The system needs to make sure they don't get seriously hurt. It's like tempering steel. This is a seriously complicated project. After they die, they have to look inward. The design requires precise removal of negative emotions, but those emotions are also part of a complete emotional spectrum. The system understands a lot, but it can't truly judge anyone's worth. It can only slightly reduce the suppression of emotions and release some inhibitions without causing harm, so the lords and heroes can access those feelings themselves. For better or worse, these rules, hard-coded into the execution logic, can't be shared with anyone. Back on the battlefield, the heat-spewing steam spider doesn't linger in the enemy ranks. It hits once, then retreats, using its speed to circle around for another attack. The original steam spider wasn't designed to retreat. The inferno it was meant to face didn't allow for distance. Deadly projectiles flew everywhere, and a well-placed shot from a heavy musket could cripple its exposed joints. That fragile mech's sole purpose was to crash into the enemy and take down as many as possible before it died, but in this era, where energy weapons are weak, it can use hit-and-run tactics. If it gets bogged down in the enemy ranks, it's likely to get tangled up by spears and pikes, and the joints and gears. This disposable mech has no protection. Distance was once its weakness, but now it's its strength. It breaks away and then charges in again. Only a perfectly aimed shot into the gear's blind spot can disable it. Cavalry is strongest on the charge, just as it's about to strike. Once it's bogged down, it's at its most vulnerable. Ji Lin knew his aggressive ambush had fatal flaws. Both the steam spider and the musketeers have a period where they can't fire. The steam spider needs to build pressure and temperature in its furnace, and the musketeers have to let their guns cool down and reload. He needs to buy time to maintain his advantage. The shock from the steam spider's charge disrupts the enemy, creating space. The musketeers reload during this lull, maximizing the steam spider's agility. This is a tactical victory. In a straight fight, Ji Lin wouldn't last against any of them. He's unarmored and outnumbered. The advantage of distance is only enough for, at most, 2 volleys. In close combat, the musketeers and light crossbowmen are outmatched, and they aren't built for both ranged and melee combat like the elite sharpshooters and elven guards. The hunting spiders help keep the musketeers out of close combat. They harass and slow down the enemy. As for the actual fighting, it's better than nothing. The elf hero archer looked over at the grey-clad soldiers. Their volleys were devastating, shattering the defense line the elves were barely holding, and the steam spiders. The elves' armor barely offered any protection against the heat. They've already lost. Let's run. They can't catch us if we run. The elf lord hesitated, wanting to drag his hero unit to safety. His other infantry hero had already died in a hail of bullets. She looked at the patrolling steam spiders and thought of their swift movement. They can't escape. If she could take one down before she went, she raised her bow, aiming at the grey-clad soldiers who were still reloading. Bang! The headless body fell from its horse, the corpse dissolving into motes of light. Changheng shifted his aim, the smoke from the muzzle disappearing into the air. What made those people think they could stand out in the open like that? The elves, leaderless and demoralized, scrambled to reload their muskets. The two lords were already typing furiously into the system. The muskets were bad enough, but they could handle that. Where did these fast-moving metal monsters come from? Unfortunately, the system had shut down both the chat forum and its communication channels. Lupo ordered his infantry regiment to retreat. He'd killed enough elves and needed to regroup to deal with this new threat, but the nightmare wasn't over. Just when Lupo thought the steam spiders would turn towards him after their second charge, they turned and ran. Lupo watched them go, moving very fast. Why? Before he could react, a massive shadow swept away the infantry on the far right, accompanied by a powerful, nauseating stench. A secondary unit, a massive figure lumbered up from the mud, shaking off the muck. A corrupted magic crab sat perched on its back. By 12, get one free. System, the system's coordinates only showed monster-sized red dots. You could tell if it was a behemoth or an infantry unit based on the number of dots, but how do you tell if the behemoth and the infantry unit are overlapping? You have to see it. Looking at the corrupted leviathan rising from the mud, with its huge back and claws bigger than the steam spiders, Lupo knew that one swipe would turn his mechs into scrap metal. The Undead's Tier 5 Special Giant Unit, the corrupted leviathan, basically a giant hermit crab, but huge, the size of a sailing ship, the real source of the death energy here. The corrupted leviathan slowly climbed from the mud, its chitinous legs sinking into the ground. Barnacle-like growths covered its body, and the water level dropped significantly. Time to get out of here, quit while you're ahead. They didn't get as much loot as if they'd wiped out both armies, but they still took out a lord. Their joint attack meant they'd split the rewards based on the damage dealt, and as for provoking that corrupted leviathan, no way. Even his muskets couldn't hurt it. He watched his infantry retreat in the distance, the giant crab tearing through the ranks, each swipe sending 10 soldiers flying. It grabbed the fleeing elven guards in its claws and tossed them into its bloody maw. The battlefield instantly became a hunting ground for those ravenous crabs. Corrupted leviathan, giant, 5 epic, melee defense, 10, movement speed, 6 km/h, armor strength, 150, morale/organization, 55, weapon power, 400, features, undead, reduced to ashes, shockwave, fear-inducing, giant devouring, restores health by consuming corpses, armor piercing, its heavy claws ignore most armor, anti-infantry. Crushes smaller units under its weight, sweeps are devastating against infantry formations, a massive deep-sea monster, it crushes everything in its path. Reanimated after death, it exists only to kill. Chapter 75 Rest and Maintenance. You are listening at novelfull.audio. In the aftermath of the ambush, the system notification popped up, killing efficiency, 62.9%. Losses, 0%. Resource acquisition, 6.29% of building resources. Because he hadn't inflicted enough damage, the system didn't award any resources. Considering the enemy's defense a success, resource theft wasn't feasible at this point, as raid damage was finalized only after a complete victory. Winning a defensive battle didn't grant resources from the attacker either. Only a successful defense followed by a counterattack, defeating the enemy, factored enemy kills into the final calculation. For both attackers and defenders, kill counts remained hidden until the final settlement. In a decisive battle, all accumulated values would combine for the ultimate resource allocation. 6% of building resources from a leader wasn't bad. Watching the enemy troops scatter like ants, their morale shattered, Ji Lin realized the system hadn't registered a decisive victory because his withdrawal was too swift. Though the data had been gathered, he still needed that final, crippling blow. But seeing the corrupted leviathan devouring the fallen, Ji Lin abandoned the pursuit. Circling around would expose him to the enemy's cavalry. and his escape would be difficult. Chasing them wasn't as worthwhile as hunting other units, especially considering his army was predominantly ranged. The scout hunting spiders were weak in direct combat, and he didn't want them cut off. Plus, the corrupted demon crabs were faster than his spearmen, a meaty problem he didn't need. There was plenty of time left. The exercise battlefield lasted at least 90 days. Before the day was up, a leader will get sent back to the war preparation area. If he had the choice, he would still catch 2 farming players and kill them. He was interested in picking the weak ones, or hide and wait for this battlefield to end. He made sure to navigate around wooded areas. While his scout hunting spiders provided reconnaissance, their effectiveness was limited. Ji-Lin lacked equipment optimized for fighting in the woods. Guns and crossbows suffered reduced efficiency behind natural barriers. Back on Blue Star, even technologically superior forces struggled against enemies in wooded terrain. Hand-to-hand combat negated ranged advantages, making a brute force sweep the most reliable option. What he really needed was concealment and distance. The woods offered concealment, but to everyone, not distance. He was wary of ambushes. He traversed the hills, deploying the scout hunting spiders in a semicircular perimeter, creating a 1-kilometer reconnaissance barrier around the team. It was nearly noon when the system dropped them in. After the battle and march, the sun cast a dark red glow. As evening approached, the team set up a smokeless stove. Equipment needed inspection and repair, and the soldiers needed rest, thus eliminating some of the light and smoke. The smokeless stove was a minor advantage he'd brought. Everyone enjoyed the meal, even the light crossbowmen who'd observed the battle, impressed by the spearmen's efficiency. The steam spider situation isn't great. We've used 1/5 of our spare parts already, Su Shan reported after inspecting the grounded steam spiders. Their engines shut down for maintenance and fuel conservation. Ji-Lin frowned. The steam spiders were consuming resources faster than expected. They had several issues: high fuel consumption, a common flaw in mechanical flyers, low mechanical efficiency, and a higher than expected failure rate. The recent charge resulted in at least 1 minor and 1 moderate damage, according to the inspection. Experimental machines always had more problems than production models. The controlled lab environment was vastly different from the battlefield. Continuous combat revealed these issues, leading to improvements. That's why equipment always has follow-up models. Being experimental didn't necessarily mean better. Production models balanced cost and solved fundamental problems, undergoing countless iterations to optimize quality. Experimental machines gained an edge through innovation and temporary technological leads. At the same time, it was important to verify whether this idea was feasible and whether it was worth continuing to invest funds. Some experimental projects, like the aviation battleship or the Caspian Sea monster, turned out to be dead ends. But even failed experiments yielded valuable data. Mature and stable weapons, on the other hand, could remain in service for years without modification. Between familiar, reliable weapons and cutting-edge technology, people gravitated towards what they knew worked. Their spare parts were meant to last 45 days, so Ji-Lin had reduced infantry rations to carry machine parts and the steam spider's crystal fuel. The soldiers' food supply was calculated according to the minimum supply of 3 days. Hunting spiders weren't picky eaters. They could dig up roots or catch rabbits and mice, even eating the soldiers' leftovers. In nature, they are still fierce and fast predators. It is not a problem to catch some small animals on the wild plains to eat. This was the weakness of mechanized forces. Unlike infantry, who only needed food to keep going, these sophisticated machines needed thorough inspections after every engagement. Everyone loved seeing them charge, but nobody wanted one exploding nearby. Su Shan and Changheng were exhausted after repairing a steam spider without assistance. They would camp for the night in a small valley. Each person gathered around an iron pot, and after inspecting the spider, Changheng had to check whether their smokeless stoves were up to standard, as this was something that depended on their lives. Dinner was rice with salted meat. The meat was boiled until tender, stewed, then served over rice, a unique and satisfying meal. Chapter 76 Hunting. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Ji-Lin watched the giant deer grazing peacefully in the distance. They were about half the size of the steam spiders, covered in snow-white fur, and moved with a graceful gait on strong, sheep-like feet, like something out of a fantasy movie. it was rare to see such a relaxed group out in the wild. They ambled across the green field, occasionally dipping their heads to dig up plant roots and munch on them. The tall grass looked tiny compared to their size. Giant deer, monster cavalry. They aren't very aggressive and generally won't attack unless provoked. In fact, they might even approach friendlier folks. They're considered a good unit, especially if you're kind to the forest. You can even sign a contract with them, bring them back to your land and raise them to get some seriously tough giant deer cavalry, definitely more docile than the corrupted magic crab. But those crabs are transformed by the undead lord's magic, turning them from mindless undead into subordinates. If the spell fails, those things go berserk, and judging by the average level of today's lord heroes, failure is pretty likely. For completely hostile monsters like the corrupted magic crab, lords like him can only wipe them out one by one and hope the system drops a blueprint for troop cultivation. He wasn't willing to gamble. Plus, he wasn't sure what a giant deer considered friendly. He wasn't an elf, and there weren't any mages, druids, or shamans in his squad. These were the only creatures he'd found after passing the 3 monster infantry locations: corrupted magic crab, toxic black bee, and skeleton construct. Toxic black bees were too fast and they fly. He didn't want to mess with those things. Skeleton constructs were humanoid monsters made from the bones of different creatures. Projectile attacks weren't very effective against them, but the light crossbowmen with burning arrows did a good job with their magic attacks. But fighting them was a waste of ammo. Burning arrows are basically one-shot wonders. Among all these monsters, there was one unit he could actually use: food, for giant deer, including 8 fawns. Enough to keep everyone fed for a while. Those thighs looked packed with meat, perfect for roasting. Giant deer. 3 rare. Melee defense, 35, speed, 25 mph, armor, 40, morale/discipline, 40, weapon power, 55, traits, forest camouflage. Giant deer born in the forest are familiar with various environments, which makes them move more quietly than others when they move. Forest stride. This unit moves faster in the woods. Berserk. This unit fights with extreme ferocity in close combat. Boosting all attributes by 10%, don't let their peaceful nature fool you. When they snap, they're lethal. An elf lord would be ecstatic to find these things. As monster shock cavalry, giant deer cavalry are way better than regular cavalry. Taking a chance, getting along with them, signing a contract, there's nothing to lose. If he could, he'd like to raise a bunch of them. Not for the battlefield, but they'd be great for hauling cargo around his territory. No coal or carbon needed, just grass and a willingness to pull trains. Later on, they could even go in a zoo to draw some crowds and ticket sales, but steam engine development was still too far off. It would take time to turn the technical knowledge into actual, working machines. Until then, he'd need something to bridge the gap. But for tonight, they were dinner: 5 musketeers per deer, and 5 crossbowmen per deer to conserve fire. Musketeers are elite units. While light crossbowmen had been rushed into training, so non-commissioned officers were selected from the taller ones. Centurions were too few because there were too few battles. Only ordinary centurions existed as top-level commanders. The scout spiders followed whistle commands. The musketeers gave the commands, and they controlled the 200 spiders. Different whistles signaled different spiders. They were plenty sensitive enough to hear it. The hunt would be in 3 phases. First, the scout spiders and steam spiders would surround them. They'd form a large circle. Lin planned to use the deer's natural instinct to flee, using the steam spiders' whistles to scare and drive them. Second, the siege team of scout spiders and steam spiders would herd the giant deer toward the musketeers and crossbowmen, like sheepdogs driving a flock. Third, once the herd was in range, unleash a volley of fire to take them down. Traps on the ground would slow them down. The plan worked like a charm. The giant deer saw the steam spiders belching white smoke, and they spooked. Their not-so-bright brains didn't recognize the trap. The steam spiders were beyond their understanding. They bolted, their nimble movements reminding Lin of nature documentaries where antelopes outmaneuvered predators. Then, just as he expected, they stumbled into the mud pit traps, slowed down, and were riddled with arrows and bullets. Only 4 of the larger, younger deer managed to avoid the channel of death. The only snag came when they were hauling the carcasses. They spotted the escaped fawns on a distant hillside, followed by riders. Someone else had been tracking these giant deer. And they were late to the party, they were too far to engage, so he could only watch them from afar. A system notification popped up, ding, hunting bounty issued, 0.5% of building resources, based on target size. The reward for hunting monster cavalry was only 0.5% of the base's building resources, less than the bounty on other lords, but it was safe and stable. No need to face other people's armies. He was also investing heavily in his territory's buildings, so the hunting rewards were relatively more significant. Chapter 77, the next stage. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Alright, spill it. What's the story? The Frost Forest clan chief's murderous glare scared the messenger half to death. It took him a minute to find his voice, then he waved the guy in, looking worn out. He knew what was coming, which cavalry unit had gone silent, and which. Someone else bit the dust on the way here, didn't they? His temper flared up again, just when he thought he'd cooled down. Damn it all. They were usually the ones doing the pillaging, but now they were getting ambushed. Right here, in the grasslands where they were supposed to be top dog. This was too big to be random. He was starting to think someone was setting traps specifically for them. Reports of casualties were flooding in like a blizzard. Even the worst years hadn't brought losses like the ones he'd seen in the report from 10 days ago. 2 of the 5 routes into the Savage Plains were completely shut down, impassable, situation unknown. The only info they'd gotten came from a scout, who rode in screaming like a lunatic. The trees. It's the trees. They're alive. Then he went into a coma and hadn't woken up since. 2 of their shortcuts into the Savage Plains were long roads carved right through the forest. If it was those legendary tree monsters, that might explain why they were getting hammered so badly. This kind of damage was usually what happened when the clans were fighting each other, but when they talked to the other camps, they found out everyone was in the same boat. Scouts had spotted hundreds of mercenaries, all mixed up and from different factions, patrolling the plains. They were well equipped and hostile to each other. It was like the plains had suddenly become a free-for-all battlefield loaded with traps. The messenger sent to the elders had come back with their latest orders, too. Carry on as usual. The clan chief was starting to suspect this was some kind of setup by them. Those old geezers from the old royal court hadn't had any guts since the last Khan died. The scraps a hunting party brought back wouldn't even fill their bellies. But they expected him to round everyone up and launch a full-blown expedition in their name. No way. Those old fossils from the royal tent were spooked by the Central Plains people. He'd been there himself. Those Central Plains types were nothing special. The Frost Forest giant wolf cavalry could run right over them. He was convinced it was time for a major raid. If it weren't for the other big clans putting the pressure on, those old men probably wouldn't have even let them participate in the Khan selection ceremony. They were calling it a hunt, but really it was about signing blood pacts with the monsters in the Savage Plains. That was how a king showed he could rule. They used their magic, runes and blood, to sign blood contracts with the monsters after they beat them. Once the contract was signed, they could control the legendary monsters. That's how the real Khan was chosen. Anyone who didn't know any better thought it was just a hunting contest. The Frost Forest clan chief was stressing out. Thinking this hard was painful for him. Meanwhile, Ji Lin, busy hunting monsters, had no idea that the system had trimmed the original dozen clans down, giving the players 20 days to wipe them out. Only the 3 clans with the biggest armies were left. The others had folded in time, and some might not have any soldiers left after retreating. They didn't bother with the system's suggestion of joining a clan, figuring they'd just kill anyone they caught. In just 20 days, the area controlled by the clans had shrunk to a 50-kilometer radius around their camp, and that was thanks to the wolf cavalry patrols. The clans were even getting reports of dragon sightings. They laughed it off. How could a mythical creature like that show up here? Until one day, a red dragon flew through the clouds above them all. It was young, but it was still a dragon. The whole Savage Plain had turned upside down in just a few weeks. The Frost Forest clan had 1,200 giant wolf cavalrymen, their main fighting force. Even though the Savage Plain was huge, this area felt like it was being swarmed by locusts. These mercenaries were stripping the place cleaner than nomads ever could, and the monsters that were still around were the toughest of the tough. The clans were launching attacks, but these wandering groups were all mixed up, and they were all hard nuts to crack. It was tough to wipe them out without bringing everyone together, and the clans were a scattered alliance. They didn't take orders from anyone, not even official announcements, unless they came from the Great Khan himself. It was almost impossible to get them to work together for a siege. They'd managed to corner and kill a few stragglers, but it always cost them. These guys fought to the death rather than surrendering. They couldn't take any prisoners. This kind of quick weeding out was usually perfect for the clans, but this time it was happening too fast, leaving everyone reeling. Eliminate the weak, select the strong. That was the way of things. They needed to move inward, and those smaller clans were going to be the first to go. After losing so many young people, they'd have to merge into the bigger clans. By combining all their resources, the big clans would have more power than ever before, and then they could launch a massive raid. But now people were running and scattering. Who was going to help them advance? He wasn't about to let his own clan members get slaughtered. "Chief, someone's here to see you from outside. Says they're with one of those wandering groups and wants to join up." The Frost Forest clan chief stopped, like he'd just figured out how to solve his manpower problem. "Send him in." A long-eared man in green walked into the tent, sizing up the huge figure sitting at the head of the table. And the chief returned the look. These long-eared guys were good fighters. He knew they were better shots than even his clan's best young warriors. He slowly said, "Go ahead. I'm listening. Take it easy, plenty more broth." Ji Lin dragged one of the survivors away from a pile of corpses to drink some broth. There were 8 of them, all that was left of a small scout unit Ji Lin had found. They'd been ambushed and slaughtered by a team of 10 horse archers. The horse archers had used their speed to close to within 120 yards and harass them. Of course, they got picked off by muskets and crossbows. If it wasn't for shock cavalry, Ji Lin wouldn't have been worried. But the horse archers weren't going to risk getting that close to muskets and crossbows. He was curious about what these scouts were doing here, dressed like nomads, so he brought them back to camp. The broth was made with wild greens and giant deer meat. It was a little bitter, but tasted good with air-dried deer jerky. Even though it was called the Savage Plains, it was surprisingly rich in natural resources, with all kinds of wild animals and a few edible plants. They'd changed their strategy over the last 20 days, choosing a small valley that was easy to defend as a base, and camouflaged it with tons of vegetation. If he kept running the steam spider around, it would break down from lack of spare parts. He was using the valley to clear out the monster infantry from his map. Saving ammo was his top priority. Replenishing supplies every 30 days was really testing his ability to manage resources. If he had horses, he could haul several times the supplies he had now. Chapter 78 Choice. You are listening at novelfull.audio. What is magic? What are runes? What's the difference between them? The biggest difference is that technology doesn't require talent. Anyone in a race can master it with hard work and dedication. Magic and runes are different. Without the right aptitude, you can't grasp or create them. Talent creates a gap you simply can't cross. Anyone can learn the basics of mechanics, using textbooks to work with gears, levers, and engines, even fixing simple equipment, but without talent, you'll never be a runecrafter, not even able to repair basic rune-powered machines. You can't build a spell model like a mage. Even if you memorize every spell in the book, you're just a paper tiger, full of talk but no action. It's the same for civilizations. If you lack a specific resource, the Mayans had no shallow iron ore and little copper, so they relied on stone. They perfected stone tool creation but never developed steel. The Brazilians were amazing sailors, navigating the Pacific, but their society remained primitive, lacking large ships. It's the resource curse in action. For these nomads, standardized magic and runes are foreign concepts. They only have shamanic training. They communicate with nature, control animals, and carve totems. These mercenaries from the far west, these primal-looking guys, are like traveling shows, demonstrating their abilities to the nomads. After clearing most of the map's resources, they turned their attention to the remaining 3 clans. Each had unique traits, but all were militarily strong, too tough for a single lord to take on. It would take at least 10 lords, uniting 10,000 troops, to stand a chance. And that's assuming they don't backstab each other, let alone coordinate an attack, who deals damage, who holds the line, and how are rewards split. If your troops are drained and damaged, what stops you from turning on me? Why target my troops instead of the neighbors? There are temporary contracts, but the game isn't implementing them yet, forcing players to learn the battlefield solo. The lords were quickly weeded out in the first 10 days, especially the aggressive ones. Constant battles drain resources, and troop and equipment losses directly impact combat effectiveness. This isn't a solo game. You can't just heal up and keep fighting. An army that only loses temporary effectiveness can recover, but losing soldiers causes lasting damage. Every casualty weakens the whole force. The chance to replenish troops appears every 30 days. This delicate balance makes lords cautious, only attacking when they have a clear tactical advantage. It also forces them to focus on logistics, troop maintenance, and support. Most lords lack even these basic concepts. Their territorial battles are short, usually within a day's round trip. They haven't explored further, which is a big mistake. Some lords are eyeing the clans for logistical support, recalling the system's king selection war. The clan chiefs are also interested in these mercenaries who show up at their doorstep. Of course, the chief has a better idea, an idea that can solve the advancement problem and deal with the mercenaries. The Xuanlin clan chief is proud of his brilliant plan. So, you want to tell me something? Ji Lin ruffled his hair, watching the black-armored scout, who had caught his breath and was staring warily back. The gleaming chainmail isn't easy to make. The armor alone suggests a strong industrial base. This standard-issue chainmail can't be made privately, just like Ji Lin's spearman's one-piece breastplates, stamped out by a hydraulic press. His fighting style is different from the nomad's felt armor, and he carries a long sword and short bow. He has the same black hair and eyes as Ji Lin, not the nomad's mixed eye colors. The guy just drinks his soup and stays quiet, so Ji Lin sighed. We're mercenaries. If you need anything, just ask. The game prevents them from revealing their true identities. They use terms like warband and mercenary to fool the NPCs on this exercise battlefield. Whether the NPCs believe them or not, their presence is a given. They just need to offer an explanation, and this scout clearly doesn't believe them. It's written all over his face. The camp is easily defended, hard to attack. The small valley, hidden among the hills, is difficult to spot. There are smokeless stoves, camouflaged walls of tall grass, and uniformed spearmen. The standard equipment even includes light crossbows, not to mention those iron lumps lying in the corner. With his experience, the scout can definitely recognize professional soldiers. He's lucky if those mercenaries are 1/10 as professional as the guy in front of him. The scout quietly thanked his savior. Thanks. Whatever the truth, the other guy had saved his life. A soldier in gray ran up to Ji Lin and whispered. Sir, the soup's all gone. The ration for one man isn't enough. Let's make another pot. The reason Ji Lin's being so nice to the black-armored scout is, he suspects these people have quests to trigger. The bitterness and hatred they radiate scream information. It's like finding a drunken vet in a tavern in an RPG, or a dying soldier on the road, or a prophet who wants you to save the world. There's always something in it for you. Chapter 79 Border Scouts. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The Savage Plains sit even farther north than Mabe, its monster-infested territory. The terrain is treacherous, with a vein cutting off the area, leaving only 5 routes in. Your mission is critical. First, confirm the safety of these routes. Second, establish a secure camp. These soldiers, the army's best, were ordered to scout the way. A well-equipped expeditionary force will follow their path, ambushing tribal members. These tribes are too caught up in the Khan's power struggle to notice cavalry suddenly emerging from behind. Right now, the enemy has the advantage of surprise, but the path to the destination and the timing of the Khan's dispute were always closely guarded royal secrets. As the border war intensified, the tribal incursions grew bolder. With the Khan holed up in his tent, it meant another decade of misery for the common folk. The scout captain didn't know what his general was thinking. His job was to follow orders, no questions asked. It was simple, do what you're told. The scout captain surveyed the remnants of his unit. Out of 30 soldiers, only 9 were left alive. Even his old warhorse had died. they had risked everything to find a safe, stable path, one they were certain was secure. The only enemy cavalry they encountered had been cut down by the mercenaries up ahead. The camp location was ideal. High ground with hills on all sides, monsters were scarce in the area, they'd barely seen any of the huge beasts along the way. If they wanted to continue the mission, they couldn't rely on their decimated scout team. Without horses, they were nothing but fresh meat on this vast plain. So, you're mercenaries. What's your price? Maybe fate wasn't ready to let them fail. He looked up at the mercenary leader, who seemed easygoing enough. The man wore plain clothes but commanded the respect of all the soldiers in the camp. Even the battle-hardened general saluted him and sat before him, ready to negotiate. The scout captain had only seen that kind of calm confidence in victorious generals. A bad soldier makes a bad general. He trusted his judgment. These mercenaries couldn't be weak. If they could be stationed here as outposts. 1,000 taels of gold. Sound good. Ji Lin agreed quickly, not just for the gold, though he could use the resources. 1,000 taels was worth 2,000 or 3,000 gold, almost a month's output from his territory, depending on the quality. Still, not a bad deal. The system displayed the following tasks. Broken Royal Court. Upon signing, you will automatically join the camp, border army. A place of life and death. Be brave and face what comes. Phase, locate the tribe's camp and relay the information to the expeditionary army. This new camp was like a training ground with NPC factions, and lords could participate individually. Different factions fought independently, not a complete free-for-all. But a lot of lords seemed to prefer fighting first and asking questions later. First things first, collecting the bodies of the fallen scouts. He sent out the hunting spider search teams to retrieve everyone. The horses were all gone, so they gathered the scouts' bodies, removed their chainmail, collected their guns and spears, and handed them over to the scout captain for safekeeping. The captain nodded silently and solemnly stowed them away. They dug a separate grave on the spot for each man, buried the bodies, and crafted simple wooden tombstones. There was no wine in the camp. His territory didn't have any crops particularly suited for brewing. Wheat beer needed hops, but maybe the territory could consider using ripe sugarcane to make white liquor. The scout captain seemed more relaxed after finishing everything, as if a weight had been lifted. He turned and peppered Ji Lin with questions, including the need to return to report and the need for a vehicle for future use. Wait, you don't have cavalry, how did you even get here? What made you think you could wander into this place without horses? The scout captain nearly choked on the words. He'd assumed the cavalry were just out on patrol, but these guys had actually dared to approach the grassland without horses. That wasn't brave, it was just dumb luck. It was like a newborn calf not knowing any better. No, it's not that we don't have any. We do have cavalry. Ji Lin, facepalming, told Changheng to fire up the steam spiders, which had been sitting idle for too long, and pump them full of fuel. Su Xiao. Su Xiao grimaced. He knew what was coming, even though the top part wasn't too hot, thanks to the insulation protecting the core, and the exhaust pipe was at the rear. It still generated a ton of waste heat. Just being near the thing was a test of endurance, riding it was a test of nerve. Safety and comfort aside, this all-terrain unit was seriously fast. As the steam spider rose slowly, shaking its head and spitting steam while extending its 6 limbs, the scout captain was floored. He'd never imagined such an amazing machine existed. By adding wooden partitions and securing them with saddles, you can create a small platform for a few guys, but I can't guarantee stability. This thing wasn't built to carry passengers. At least you can sit, right? Su handed Ji Lin the plan, and the scouts still had one task to complete, locating the remaining tribes. The system helpfully indicated that only 3 tribes needed investigation, just 3 out of a dozen. These guys were efficient. Could they be lords at the same stage as him? But given how quickly we're clearing out monsters, there won't be many resources left. Even with half the lords gone, there are still over 100 survivors. Each of those could field an army of 1,000, adding up to 100,000 troops. I wonder what those near-exhausted lords are up to. Thinking it over, the data feels a bit sparse since opening the secondary version. I've been hunting for similar books for reference, but no luck. I'll just have to wing it. But I hear what you want to read.